Here's how it works. PJM doesn't just buy electricity, it buys guarantees. Once a year, PJM holds an auction to pay power plants to promise they'll be ready with electricity on the worst days of the year. It's essentially a billion-dollar pinky promise that there's going to be electricity when there's a January freeze or an August heat wave. You can think of it like insurance. They pay a premium so the grid doesn't fail when it's needed most. For most of this century, that insurance was dirt cheap because American electricity demand flatlined for 20 years. It made the capacity auction the single most boring event in American finance. In the auction covering 2024, a promise of power cleared at about $29 per megawatt day. Then, the data centers arrived. Not one at a time, by the dozen. Buildings that each swallow as much electricity as a small city, walking into a system designed for a world where demand barely grew. And the data centers don't want power eventually. They want it now, guaranteed, forever. The next auction cleared at just under $270, a more than 830% spike. The regional bill went from $2.2 billion to $14.7 billion. The same promise, 7 times the price. The biggest leap since the capacity market was invented in 2007. That got attention. Governors across the region leaned on PJM, federal regulators signed off, and the auction got a ceiling, a legal maximum on what the grid was allowed to pay. The very next auction hit that ceiling. So did the one after it, and the one after that. What looked like a spike turned out to be the new floor. Then came December 2025, and something happened that had never happened in PJM's history. The auction came up short. Each auction is built around a target reserve margin. It's the extra safety cushion of power supply required above expected peak demand to guarantee the grid can handle those worst days of the year. It's basically the backups in case of an emergency. For the first time in history, PJM went shopping with more money than ever before and paid the maximum price allowed under federal law, but there still wasn't enough power supply to go around. And that's the physical reality of the grid. All that money can't summon a gas turbine, a transformer, or a transmission line out of thin air when the world's manufacturers are booked years out in advance. Which means the grid failed to buy what it needed and then paid full price for what it got. And the bill for all this doesn't just get sent to big tech, it gets sent to you. It flows straight into your electric bills. The average household in Maryland saw their electric bill rise by $21 a month, or nearly $250 per year. Which may not sound like a lot at first, until you remember that's just the average, for one household, in one state. When you remember that PJM covers 13 states and 67 million people, it's a lot. PJM pays an independent watchdog called Monitoring Analytics. They ran the numbers on the December auction and found that of the $16.4 billion the auction will cost, roughly $6.5 billion can be traced directly to data centers. 40 cents of every capacity dollar traced to data centers. Across the last 3 auctions, the number is more than $23 billion. So that's clock 1, the power clock. The infrastructure can't keep up with the demand, money can't speed it up, and there's no clear path to fixing it. These companies just have to wait, which sounds survivable. Annoying and expensive, but survivable. Because late is better than never. Unless the thing doing the waiting has an expiration date, and spoiler, it does. Which brings us to clock 2, the chip clock. The one that determines how long we can afford to wait. Because those data centers are really just massive warehouses for a single product, semiconductor chips, specialized processors that train AI, and the most expensive piece of the entire bet. Of the more than $700 billion a year, the biggest chunk is spent on the chips and computing hardware. And there are 2 problems with these chips. The first is, they don't age well. Think of that one grandma of yours who hasn't worn sunscreen since the 70s. A cutting-edge AI chip stays cutting-edge for somewhere between 2 to 6 years, depending on who you ask. Newer, faster chips arrive, and the old ones slide toward worthless. But the infrastructure those chips are living on lasts for decades. So the chips age like a smartphone, and the infrastructure ages like a bridge. That mismatch has a price tag. If a data center scales back, or its chips go obsolete after a few years, the multi-billion-dollar grid equipment built to serve it stays on the utility's books for decades, and a chunk of that cost gets shifted to the utility's customers, meaning you. And then there's the second problem, the bigger one. Right now, tech companies are reporting record earnings. On the surface, you could maybe even say, what AI bubble? But Michael Burry, the investor from the movie The Big Short, thinks those record earnings are an illusion. He believes big tech's cooking the books, and like most things in finance, he believes it comes down to sneaky accounting. When a company buys a machine, it spreads the cost across the years the machine stays useful, called the useful life. That schedule is called depreciation. Stretch the useful life out, and your annual depreciation drops, making profits look bigger today. Shrink the years, and your annual depreciation expense rises, lowering your reported profits. Which means one boring accounting guess: how long does a chip stay useful? Quietly determines billions in big tech earnings. And the problems arise when nobody agrees on the answer. The tech giants started extending the official useful life of their servers from a 3 or 4 year standard to 6 years. Burry says the real number is much lower. If he's right, the industry is understating depreciation by about $176 billion between 2026 and 2028. By Burry's math, this would overstate Oracle's earnings by nearly 27% by 2028, and Meta's by almost 21%. NVIDIA fired back immediately at this. They said that their customers get 4 to 6 years out of these chips just fine. What we're watching is a classic kindergarten game of he said, she said. That's also what makes this interesting, because whether you side with Burry or NVIDIA doesn't actually matter, because the tech companies themselves can't agree on the answer. In January 2024, Amazon decided its servers would last 6 years instead of 5. That single decision reduced its depreciation expense by $3.2 billion and added $2.5 billion to its profit for the year. 12 months later, Amazon changed its mind. They walked the estimate from 6 years back down to 5 for subsets of their servers and networking equipment. The reason Amazon gave in the filing was the increased pace of technology development, particularly in artificial intelligence. And while Amazon was walking some things back, Meta went the opposite direction. Meta extended the life of its servers and network assets to 5.5 years. That single change reduced its 2025 depreciation costs by $2.9 billion and added roughly $1 to Meta's earnings per share. So, same technology, same time period, 2 accounting departments, looking at the same silicon and reaching opposite conclusions. And that's the race we have. There are 2 clocks ticking. One says new power infrastructure can take 5 to 10 years to build. The other says today's AI chips may only be economically cutting edge for 3 to 6 years, depending on who you ask, of course. If those clocks fall out of sync, billions of dollars of infrastructure could arrive for a very different AI market than the one companies are planning for today, and the race is already being timed. Goldman Sachs looked at how often data centers actually open on schedule. Historically, only about 72% of projects due within the next year showed up on time. When you adjust for today's supply chain and labor problems, Goldman expects about 60% of next year's promised capacity to arrive when promised. Look 2 years out, and it drops to 50%. Flip a coin. That's the current odds the AI future arrives on schedule. And Bloomberg's energy research arm found something even uglier. They ran 2 forecasts side by side. The first asks a simple question. Based on how many AI chips are actually being sold, how much data center capacity should America be building? The second asks a harder one. How much can America actually power? They found that by 2033, the gap will be 63 gigawatts apart. For context, every operational data center in America adds up to a little over 40 gigawatts. So, the gap Bloomberg found isn't a small rounding error. To deliver the future these companies have already paid for, America would have to find a way to power a gap half as large as every data center the country's already built. That took decades to build, on a grid that now has an 8-year wait list. The math doesn't just look bad, the math looks impossible. Which brings us to the age-old question. How did we get here? How does the entire energy supply chain get this backed up? Well, here's the uncomfortable answer. It's not because AI is failing, it's because it isn't. The demand is painfully real. Everyone wants in. Data centers drove roughly half of America's electricity demand growth last year. The line for power is measured in years because everyone showed up at once. If you've seen my previous videos, it's the flood stage of the capital cycle. Success is what broke the grid. And the chips? How does the most expensive hardware on Earth expire so fast? Again, not because AI stalled, because it didn't. Every new generation of chips buries the one before it. The technology is moving so fast that its own products can't hold their value. Success is what kills the chips. So the better AI does, the more demand floods the grid, and the longer clock one takes. The faster AI improves, the quicker the hardware goes stale, and the shorter clock 2 gets. Success winds both clocks against each other. Now, if you'd rather get your financial news from people yelling about earnings beats, no hard feelings. But if you want the deeper stuff, the stuff buried in government reports and depreciation schedules, hit subscribe, because it's those boring documents where the real stories actually live.